Today we are going to show you how to create this unique cutting board with an epoxy handle. We start by placing our pieces into the form and clamping them down so they don't float when we pour the epoxy. This form is the 18-inch by 36-inch resealable form, which comes with a divider, and it's ideal for pieces like this. Once your pieces are clamped down, it's time to start mixing epoxy and pigment. This color is called Caribbean, and it's from Black Diamond Pigments, which is available on our website. The epoxy we are using is the EcoPoxy FlowCast, and that's our go-to epoxy for deeper pours like this. It's important to mix your epoxy thoroughly with the pigment. You don't want any mica powder in clumps or stuck to the edge of the pail. We normally mix for about 5 minutes with this paddle mixer. Once your epoxy is thoroughly mixed, it's time to pour. One of the most common questions that we get is how to mix the right amount of epoxy, and that calculation is pretty simple. Using inches, simply multiply the river's length by average width by depth and divide that number by 61. And that will give you the total numbers of liters needed for your pour. After the epoxy cures, it's time to remove your piece from the form, and you can just see how easy that is with this reusable form. I'd highly recommend these for any beginner or professional, as it makes this process a lot easier. Now it's time to surface our piece, and you can see here that we are using a planer. There's other ways of doing this. You can simply sand the piece, or if you've got a wide drum sander or a belt sander, you can also use those. Another option, if you've got larger pieces, would be to build a router sled or use a CNC. Now that our piece is surfaced, we take it over to our table saw to rip it to width. And if your piece is too big to send through the table saw, you can also use a track saw. After the piece is ripped to width, we take it over to our chop saw to trim it to final length. Next up, we draw the handle profile we want and we cut it out with a jigsaw. You can see here we just cut close to the line, and then we use a spindle sander to remove the excess material and finalize our profile. If you don't have a spindle sander, you'll just have to cut a lot closer to the line with your jigsaw. You'll notice how handy this spindle sander is for those inside radiuses. Next, we start sanding at 60 grit with our orbital sander just to remove any rough spots. Then we work our way up through 80, 100, 120, and 150 grit. This board was set to get a custom engraving, so we want to make sure it's pretty flat and smooth before it goes to the laser. Unfortunately, we didn't get any footage of the engraving on this one, so we're going to jump straight from the sanding to the engraving filling process. When filling engravings, you occasionally get bleed out from the epoxy seeping through the grain of the wood, so we normally take some polyurethane and just give it a spray to eliminate some of that bleeding. Multiple passes in a few different directions will make sure that you've got all the sides of your engraving and the top surface of the wood thoroughly covered. This engraving is getting a simple black fill, so we're using our Black Diamond Pigments Black Onyx mixed with some EcoPoxy UV epoxy, which is designed for shallower pours such as this one. Again, when mixing epoxy and pigment, you want to make sure you mix it really thoroughly. This isn't a part that you want to skimp out on. Now that it's thoroughly mixed, it's time to pour. Within a few minutes of filling the engraving, we like to go back over it with a popsicle stick and make sure it's thoroughly spread out and all the nooks and crannies are filled. Then we take a torch and give it a light pass over that epoxy to remove all the bubbles. Once the epoxy cures, we take our sander out and we remove any excess epoxy as well as that polyurethane spray that we use to prevent the bleed out. You'll see it takes a few minutes to get through this step, but it's better to not be too aggressive and sand right through your engraving. Now it's time to add our edge detail, and we're giving this one a 1/4 inch round over. We forgot to get footage of adding the hole in the handle, but we did that over on the drill press with a Forstner bit. Other edge details that we find look really nice on these boards are a 1/8 chamfer or a 1/8 round over. You'll notice the epoxy and the wood both machine very similarly with a router bit, so you don't have to switch bits when you're moving from epoxy to wood. Once you've added the profile to the entire piece, it's time to sand it. We're just using a contour pad here to get into all the radius edges. And then we'll switch over to the orbital sander to do all the straight edges on this piece. On a board like this, we'll sand it up to 220 grit before applying an oil finish. For this board, we opted to use Rubio Monocoat Pure. It's a food-safe finish, and since this board won't be cut on and will be used more for display or charcuterie purposes, it's perfectly applicable for this scenario. On smaller pieces like this, we'll pour the oil onto the piece and then use a piece of white Scotch-Brite pad to spread and buff the oil into the piece. On larger pieces, we'll normally use a sander or a buffer and work the oil in that way. A piece this size will normally take 4 or 5 minutes to fully oil and wipe down. It's important to make sure all the surfaces are covered and that all the excess oil is wiped away. You don't want any excess oil just sitting on the piece overnight because it'll turn into a sticky, clumpy spot. As a general rule of thumb, we'll keep wiping the piece down until there is no excess oil coming up on the shop towel. We were pretty happy with how this board turned out, so check out these finish shots and let us know what you think about that little wood piece on the handle.